Welcome to tonight's talk. Welcome everyone. So tonight I decided to talk about dependent arising and indicate or demonstrate how dependent arising is behind suffering as well as liberation. So dependent arising is the principle the Buddha explained or used for how things arise and how they cease, how they arise and also how they disappear. It's quite complex and difficult to understand, yet it could be understood by considering that when there is a cause for something, something arises. When there is no cause for something, that something does not arise. In the sutras, it's spoken of like this. When this is, that is. Because this arises, that arises. When this is not, that is not. Because this ceases, that ceases. So sometimes dependent arising has been called interdependence. Sometimes it's called, I think I heard Thich Nhat Hanh talk about interbeing, meaning that things come into being in an interdependent way. Sometimes it's been called life, because it is the principle that explains emptiness, for example, and I've given talks about emptiness. Emptiness of being the same as not self, meaning that there's no essential thing in all this, but it's a mass of interdependent phenomena arising and passing, coming together, and causes and conditions coming together and rising and passing. So this principle is evident in the Four Truths. So, as you know, the Four Truths describe the Four Noble Truths, or ennobling truths, sometimes they're called, depending on the degree of awakening or realization. But the first truth, of course, is the reality of dukkha, or unsatisfactoriness or suffering. The second noble truth is the reality of the origins of dukkha, being in our minds, being greed, ignorance and hatred. The third noble truth is reality of freedom from dukkha. And the fourth noble truth is the path, the way to be free. So when there is the second reality, the causes of suffering or the causes of dukkha, there is also the first reality. And when there is no craving, the second reality, one of the root causes is craving. Actually, the Buddha says the root cause of suffering is craving, yet, as I'll explain in a minute, it's just one pretty significant interdependent factor in this cycle of going round and round in wheels of samsara. So when there's the second reality, there's the first reality, being dukkha. When there is no second reality, when there's no craving, for example, and there is the Eightfold Path, then there is liberation, or freedom from dukkha, or nibbana. So dependent arising isn't considered of in a linear way. It's not like over time. It's, even though in practical realities we talk about that, but in actual fact, it's not, cause-effect relationship, one thing happening after the other. It's not like this linear progression. It is, in fact, co-arising in the only time there is, which is now. As you know, time is a concept. So the way it is this arises, and as this arises, that also arises. In the now, in this moment. So that's how it's, in reality, in absolute reality, that's the way it is. But we tend to understand it as cycles. In our, a conventional way of understanding things, we understand as cycles. And it's often explained as having 12 cyclic interdependent links. And these are the links, they sort of go around in a circle. They go round in what's called the wheel of birth, aging, sickness and death, the wheel of samsara, actually. And so it doesn't really start anywhere, but let's start at ignorance. Ignorance leads to mental formations. When there is mental formations, it leads to consciousness. This leading to name and form, or mind and body, or nama rupa in Pali. Nama meaning body, mind, and rupa meaning body. And when there's nama rupa, or body and mind, there are six-fold sense bases. These six-fold sense bases are sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, and mind. Mental, the mind is considered as a sense perceptor. So when there is these, there is contact. Contact means the place where objects of senses come together with the senses, if that makes sense. So there's contact when I look out, there's visual contact when I look over there and I see a table or a lounge. There's the coming together of that visual object and the sense. That's called contact. It's where they meet. It's the place they meet. When there is contact, there's feelings. Feelings being either pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant or unpleasant. The hedonic tone of experience. When there is feelings, there is craving. When there is craving, there is clinging, becoming, birth, aging, sickness and death, going back to ignorance. So it's this kind of wheel. Often it's described in lifetimes, but one can also understand it in a moment. This dependent arising happens now. So two powerful links to exit the cycle are those links between feelings, when something's pleasant, unpleasant or neither, and the craving. It is possible to exit the cycle. Often when the wheel of samsara, feelings, if something's feeling pleasant, we usually grasp and crave after it. We want it. If something's feeling unpleasant, we push it away. And if something's feeling neither pleasant or unpleasant, we sort of kind of get ambivalent towards it. We're not sure whether we're pushing it away or pulling it in. We're just kind of not seeing it clearly. So if we can be aware of this, it is possible to not feed into the craving. And there's three types of craving. Craving for sensual pleasures, which is kind of easy to understand when we think about our addictions, like our addictions to money, food and sex, for example. That's based on sensual cravings. Or it could be anything, really. It could be cravings for, I'll talk about the other cravings first. Then there's something called, that first type of craving is called kama tanha. The second type of craving is called bhava tanha, and it means craving for existence. To be somebody. I want to be somebody. It's the desire to be something different than the way we actually are. To be somebody, to become somebody. And the other type of craving, vibhava tanha, which means the craving for non-existence, the craving to cut it out, to push it away, to like aversion to things, like just having enough, wanting to blot it out. At its extreme end, it's the desire to suicide, it's the craving for suicide. But at more subtle ends, it's like how we want to turn off at the end of the day, we just want to turn it off. We've had enough. It's kind of that craving. So recently, and I want to talk about a personal experience now. Recently, I was reading about the jhanas. The jhanas, as you may know, are states of deep concentration. And and as they're described in the Path of Purification, or the Visuddhimagga, which is this fat text tome that was written 9 centuries after the Buddha's passing, they're quite refined and sophisticated. And sometimes it says that rarely people attain the jhanas, but there's a bit of controversy about the depth of the jhanas. Nonetheless, when I read about them, or when I listen to talks about them, I sometimes feel inspired. Sometimes I feel uplifted. And because I can recognize, there's elements of my practice that may lead towards the jhanas. It's fantastic. Other times, when I hear about them, depending on whether my kilesa is pretty thick. Now, kilesa, another word for kilesa are mental defilements. Mental defilements are those another word is mental distortions, like distortions of greed, ignorance and hatred. But there's a whole range of them. If my mental distortions are quite strong, sometimes I hear about the jhanas and I think, they're so out of reach. I'm not good enough. I'm not skillful enough. My concentration's so poor. I'm not enlightened enough. And all these not enoughs. What I'm doing is in fact developing self-conceit, like the conceit I am. Now, some of you may remember me giving a talk about the conceit I am, one stage. The conceit I am is called a fetta, one of the fettas, something that holds us back. It's a hindrance, but it's not classified as a hindrance, it's classified as a fetta. The conceit I am is this conceit that we are something, that it's our identification with a self-concept. And we all have it until we're enlightened. Even on the stages of awakening, we only let this conceit I am go at the final stage of enlightenment, arahantship. So it's here with us. It's this tendency to believe that we are identified with a concept. So what's happening for me at this point is I start to identify with it being a failure. I'm not good enough. I'm something. And this happens all the time with my clients. I mean, I see they're commonly identifying with this self-concept that I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, I'm a waste of space, I'm not deserving, blah, blah, blah. It's all this I am. And sometimes I feel like shaking them and saying, snap out of it. It's just conceit. This is just conceit. So, fortunately, when I have these experiences, my practice is strong enough for me to recognize this tendency. So if you go back, if you look at this tendency, the conceit I am, and you look back further, it's based on a craving. It's based on craving to be somebody. And I heard a talk by Ajahn Amaro. He's talking about how the craving to be somebody is often common with meditators and monastics, for example, because they want to get enlightened. They want to be an enlightened being. However, it's a hindrance. If you can identify this craving, the craving to be something, the craving to move out of the present moment and not really accept reality as it is, this moment, as we actually are, we start to get pushed along to clinging, then becoming, and the self-conceit is at the becoming section. So if you trace it back to clinging, you trace it back to craving, and you can trace it back to that unpleasant feeling that I would have got. This is myself. That unpleasant feeling I would have got when I was reading something about the jhanas and how refined and how these people have these different states of mind, and I think, I haven't experienced that. That's an unpleasant feeling. So I crave, it triggers craving to be somebody. I think that's really interesting. And then you become this, I don't know, self-conceit that I'm a failure, I'm not a good enough meditator. What am I doing teaching meditation? I can't meditate, blah, 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 blah. So, just as dependent arising leads to suffering, dependent arising can also lead to freedom, lead to psychological freedom, can lead to wisdom. And it can also lead to the jhanas, ironically, as well. It's like, I think when we start to practice, we see that there's nobody behind all this stuff, and that it's just a matter of causes and conditions coming together. We start to develop a trust in nature, a trust in making choices, and then those choices leading to particular outcomes. So there is something called the 5 faculties in Buddhism. The 5 faculties. These 5 faculties are saddha, otherwise translated as faith, confidence, trust, hopefulness versus hopelessness. And sometimes you can see it as hope, but I think hope sometimes can be confused with kind of wanting something. If you consider hopefulness, it's the opposite of hopelessness. With hopelessness, we sort of give up and, oh, what's the possibility here? But trust and confidence. I do think that saddha, and I can be corrected on this, I heard once that saddha, if you break down the syllables of that term, it means where we place our heart, what inspires us, and the confidence in going that direction. Trust and confidence are very similar. Confidence is having had an experience and knowing of doing something and having an outcome, and knowing that if you do it again, it's very likely that that outcome will happen again. So you're confident that if you follow a particular pathway, something positive will result. Trust is having not had an outcome, but knowing in your heart that it's possible. So, I have a lot of confidence in the reality of Nibbana. I have a lot of confidence in that truth. So when I have confidence, which is trust, it co-arises with energy. And this is one of the second indriya. I'll tell you the indriya, they're saddha, energy or viriya, mindfulness or sati, concentration or samadhi, wisdom or panya. And it's this interdependent cycle. It's like one leads to another, leads to another. And I'm saying that they are co-arising. They're an example of dependent arising. So, when I have trust in something, when I can see through my blah, 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 conceit I am bullshit, I can then start to have trust in awakening, trust in the possibility, trust in wisdom. And that gives me energy, which is the second indriya, the second faculty. When I have energy, I'm kind of motivated and persevere with things, and awareness arises. Or I'm able to bring my awareness to something. I'm able to be mindful of something and monitor it and see it, which is the third indriya or the third faculty. When we have mindfulness and there's some sort of sustaining of that, it's like our mental energies gather around and focus and unify, which is samadhi or concentration. With energy, mindfulness and concentration, which are the 3 factors, the meditation factors of the Eightfold Path, that leads to wisdom. It's like they all come together and they produce wisdom, which is the fifth faculty or the fifth indriya. And with wisdom, we see things as they actually are. We see the reality of a situation. We understand it. And, I think that with wisdom we can also see the truth of the way things are. Nibbana. And even at a relative level, we can see more clearly the reality of a situation. Even though we may not realize Nibbana at that point, we can still realize the possibilities of a freedom from our relative dukkha. And that inspires us to trust, to have confidence, for saddha. So what we have here is that when one thing arises, another thing arises, another thing arises. And this example is just one of the many systems in the teachings of the Buddha that are demonstrations of dependent arising being, what's the word? It's not that it's utilized, it's just demonstrated in a way that results in freedom, psychological freedom. So thank you very much. I trust that this Dharma talk has been helpful for some people, and may we all be free from the kilesa, those mental defilements, those tendencies, and realize true freedom. Thank you.